national conversations of the season. So these events have been going on for a few years by the Fire Science Committee, and this is the first one of our season. And the Fire Science Committee has been recently renamed the Research and Innovation Integration Committee, and it is also renaming because of focusing on knowledge exchange and mobilization and integrating science into the agencies. And we have a lineup of absolutely fantastic speakers for everybody. This is the next generation of researchers, essentially. And today we will be welcoming Jen, Tristan, Kate, and Celan, who will be sharing some of their research. And I really want to say that we are looking forward to audience participation in the chat. If you guys have questions or anything, pop that in. We're going to go through the 4 presentations and hopefully we'll have some time for questions and interaction at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to pop it over to our first speaker, Jen. And thank you all and welcome. Jen, there's a little bit of feedback on yours. I don't know if you happen to have headsets or something like that, but
I think try turning your mic off, Heather.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks for having me. My name is Jen Barron. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Forestry, and today I'm going to present on a recent manuscript that we produced on fuel typing in British Columbia. This is a pretty long manuscript. It's been accepted with minor revisions, so I've tried to condense some of the salient points down, but I'm very happy to discuss more of the details either during the questions or feel free to reach out if this work interests you. This work was done primarily as a collaboration between UBC Faculty of Forestry through Laurie Daniels' lab and Paul Hesberg's lab with the U.S. Forest Service, and then also in part collaboration with the Canadian Forest Service. So as many of us know, fuels characterizations are very important, but they're also very challenging. So understanding fuels as a component of the fire environment is critical, but measuring and mapping fuels remains challenging, largely in part because of the complexity and diversity of fuel components in the fire environment. So the number of parameters and then the range of infinite conditions that those parameters can take, both in their composition, their configuration, and their condition, so fuel moisture as well. And so fuel description systems exist to simplify this problem of characterizing fuels. And of course, one that we're likely all familiar with is the FBP system, which is a subset of the Canadian Forest Fire Danger Rating System. But this is just one of many fuel description systems that exist internationally. And I'll note that this system takes an association approach. So as opposed to directly measuring fuel components, it associates aspects of structure and composition with predicted fire behavior. And so it consists of 16 official fuel types that we associate primarily with forest structure, but also to some extent with forest composition. Mapping fuels at a broader spatial scale becomes even more challenging, in part due to the absence of data and extensions of these systems into broad spatial scales. So there's a number of remotely sensed fuel mapping products that exist that are used for research, management, and operations to varying degrees. And so in British Columbia, the primary layer that is often used is a provincial classification produced by the BC Wildfire Service. This is based on an expert-informed decision tree that was developed at the Canadian Forest Service, and it's based on provincial forest inventory data. So essentially, it relies primarily on aspects of forest stands related to composition and then to some extent structure to a lesser extent. So things like density and crown closure to assign FBP fuel types. In addition, there are national level fuel mapping products. The most recently publicly available one is from 2019, and this is at a coarser resolution, so 250 meters. This also uses a more simplified decision tree process based on national forest inventory and land cover that's again primarily driven by species composition and then structure to a lesser extent. So despite their widespread use, the accuracy and applicability of these fuel type maps in British Columbia specifically has not been assessed. And in particular, because BC's fuel compositions are not particularly well represented by the FBP system, we wanted to look at the applicability of the fuel type maps to conditions in interior BC and to quantify the agreement between fuel type maps and on-site assessments. And so this study was done in southeastern British Columbia in the Rocky Mountain Trench, which is a dry, low elevation system with montane mixed conifer forests at mid elevation. It is very similar to dry interior forests across interior British Columbia that have increasingly been facing fire challenges and also are not particularly well represented by the system. So I'm going to go straight into results for the sake of time. I'm happy to answer questions about our methods later on. So first, looking at the applicability, we found that for 42% of our total 76 plots, there was an applicable fuel type within the system. And in particular, when we were assigning fuel type, we found that C7, C3, C4, and O1 were most applicable in the system. However, we found that for the majority of our plots, 58% of plots, there was no applicable fuel type within the FBP system that matched both structure and composition. In terms of where they didn't match, 29% of the time, they mismatched composition. So that's to say we assigned a fuel type based on structure when the composition of the stand didn't match. So for example, a dense Douglas fir stand with the same density of immature jack or lodgepole pine might be assigned to C4 based on structure when the composition differs. 2% of the time, the stands mismatch structure, which is to say that the majority of the time, we were assigning a fuel type based on the closest structural match as described by the FBP system. And 26% of the time, there was no applicable fuel type or no acceptable correspondence in terms of both the composition and the structure of the stand. And these cases are particularly challenging where there is no analog. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit to where some of these mismatches occurred. So we conducted a number of comparisons. The first two I'm going to show is agreement between the field observations and the provincial national products. We found that only 26% of the time there was agreement between the field assigned fuel type and the provincial assignment. And these mismatches most commonly occurred between the C7 and O1, C3 and C7, and C4 and C7 fuel types. Similarly, at a national level, there was even lower agreement of 17% between the remotely sensed product and field assessments, and similar mismatches between C7 and O1, C3 and C7, and C4 and C3. We also conducted some comparisons between intermediate products to control for the impact of the process, so our own assignment of fuel type, and to control for the data source that was being used, so provincial inventory data versus field data. So in this case, we are comparing the field assigned fuel type with field validation fuel type, which is using field attributes. So same data, different process. So the field validation is processed through the same decision tree as the provincial forest inventory data is processed through, but using the field attributes. And so we found even controlling for the fuel assignment process, so removing the subjective nature from fuel type assessments, there was still only 25% agreement between the processes, again, with large amounts of mismatches from C3 and C7 and C4 and C7. And then in addition, when we compare the field validation to the provincial data, so controlling for the data source and using a different process, we found similarly low levels of agreement, which is to say that it's both the process and the provincial errors from provincial inventory data that are resulting in the mismatches. So in terms of mismatches, in terms of common forest structures, we identified 3 situations or cases where mismatches were most common. The first is a broad category of dry interior ecosystems across gradients of structure and composition, but influenced by a prior history of disturbance and management. So the C7 fuel type is often applied for anything that has leading interior Douglas fir or Douglas fir composition, which is meant to reflect frequent fire maintained ecosystems. However, for most of southeastern and most of southern interior British Columbia, these ecosystems don't represent their historical conditions. And so the fuel structures and the predicted fire behavior also don't particularly match well to the C7 fuel type. In addition, we found many challenges working with the mixed wood and deciduous fuel types. In particular, Western larch is an important stand species, often co-dominating mixed conifer stands. In both decision tree processes, any presence of Western larch shifts the fuel type into the M2 or D2 fuel types, when we found that structurally they were more consistent with a C3 or C7 fuel type. And finally, we found post-harvesting conditions to be particularly challenging. So both recent harvesting, different types or phases of slash disposal, and different phases of forest regeneration were very challenging to represent with the system and did not match well with any of the fuel types. And then we looked a little bit into what the sources of these mismatches were. So first, we identified the forest inventory data and its ability to represent fuel conditions as a limiting factor. So provincial forest inventory data in British Columbia is primarily focused on merchantable trees, which often excludes non-merchantable biomass. But in a broader context, it's reliant on manual air photo interpretation, which is often outdated and obscures subcanopy features. So any subcanopy fuels are not characterized. So we found, comparing the field data to the provincial forest inventory data, that it mismatched species composition for 42% of plots. And then we also looked at some quantitative measures, and we found that on average, it underpredicted canopy cover by 10%, canopy height by 4 meters, and perhaps most significantly, live density by over 700 stems per hectare. And for 30% of our plots considered in the study, the data was at least 20 years old, meaning that the imagery hadn't been updated since prior to the year 2000. In addition, we identified the applicability of the fuel typing system to these stands as one of the limiting factors. So we note that the original 16 fuel types were never intended to be comprehensive or without revision, and this was noted in the first provincial classification of fuel types for BC in 1995. And in particular, the FEP system is now being applied in novel fuel structures and at scales that it was never developed to be used at, and in forests that were not sampled by the original fuel types. So the emphasis on boreal stand structures and fuel conditions challenges the applicability in interior British Columbia. And so often the FPP system is described as a blend of an art and a science, and we agree with this stipulation, but the extent to which the system is being applied outside the context it was developed for leans the application of it very strongly towards art and very lightly towards science. And so in terms of the implications of this work, we see implications for both suppression and proactive operations. In particular, when speaking with FBANs, we found that there was low confidence in the ability to predict expected fire behavior unless the fire was already burning in those stand conditions. And this challenges decision-making both on the over-predicting fire behavior side, which limits ability to do prescribed fire operations or planned ignitions, and potentially under-predicting fire behavior in denser stand structures, which could put resources at risk. And then we saw a great concern in a fuels management context. So these fuel type maps are often used to do fire behavior modeling to make decisions about where to put fuel treatments. And if the fuel type maps don't represent the stand conditions or the relative density of fuels, then it's very challenging to accurately determine where the risk is. And then finally, from a fire research perspective, this often requires we use a make-fit approach where we often assign our own interpretation of the best fit fuel type based on the information that we have. But that is extremely challenging from a reproducibility perspective, and also because we don't have the opportunity typically to watch the stand burn before we assign a fuel type. And so in addition, from a modeling perspective, this can result in widespread propagation of error, both for stand and landscape level modeling, which increasingly with the focus on landscape level fire resilience creates many challenges. So in terms of our recommendations for a way forward and improving fuels characterizations, we highlight a significant need for improved forest inventory data, and particularly forest inventory data that represents fuel components. And while we identify that some of these components can be significantly improved using remotely sensed data, it will also require field surveys and plot level data, particularly to inventory understory attributes and to train canopy attribute models. However, fundamentally, we find that fuel characterizations are limited by the FBP system. And in particular, we recommend a transition to a fuel classification approach to decouple the relationship between surface, ladder, and canopy fuels and directly measure individual fuel attributes. And finally, I'll conclude with the concept that the relationship between fuels and fire behavior can't be understood without data for the systems we seek to represent. So this is to say that we need data from current stand structures and current fire behavior in the systems that we're interested in managing fire for in order to make accurate predictions, particularly under climate change as conditions continue to change. All right, thank you. That's all.
All right, thank you very much, Jen. That was awesome. I know it's a little bit rapid fire, but we're going to switch over to Tristan now. And there we go. Tristan, you are loaded. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Everybody hear me? Okay, hello everyone. My name is Tristan Skretting. I am a master's student at the University of Lethbridge under the supervision of Dr. Laura Chasmer, and I'm very excited to speak with you a bit about my research assessing the longevity of fuel reduction treatments as a case study in Jasper National Park. Now we all know that fuels reduction is really the only thing we can do before a fire occurs to mitigate the intensity and severity of these things, and also to make fires safer to action for firefighters. With the increasing length of fire season and occurrence of high hazard fire weather indices, and recognizing that wildland fuel has built up over the past century due to suppression, fuel reduction is, of course, of increasing interest and importance across the country. In Jasper, they have been reducing fuels around the town site with FireSmart and similar mechanical prescriptions for over 2 decades. This has increased in the past 5 years due to they've had quite a severe mountain pine beetle infestation starting in around 2011, peaking in 2018 where they had a die-off. And so now we're not seeing much new infestation, but we're left with a legacy of over 90% of the lodgepole pine being dead standing fuel, needleless gray phase, interspersed with the other living species. And so that, coupled with some of the research coming out of the Daniels lab, actually finding overall 5 missed fire return intervals in the montane areas of the park, as well as homogenization of fuels, increased ladder fuels due to that fire suppression, as well as increasing values at risk. So the buildings in the town site, park infrastructure, as well as some industry in the form of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, has led to extensive efforts in fuel reduction, mainly around the town. However, the timing and impact of regenerating fuels on is less well known than the immediate effects of fuel management and that mitigation on potential fire behavior. So my objectives are to see how fuel loadings vary over time since fuel reduction treatment, to see if I can pinpoint a time since management or fuel component threshold where maintenance may be required, and to see how understory structure and canopy fuel load after treatment it can impact the rate of spread and crown fire potential. So my study area here, in the red we have mountain pine beetle severity sites. Don't worry about those so much today, maybe that's for another day, but in the blue box here we have our management sites over the summers of 2021 and 2022. Well, I guess like a week each of each of those summers. We collected next generation Canadian forest fire danger rating system mensuration plots, and so we have unmanaged, they're Doug fir spruce mix, and then we have a chronosequence of time since management near the town, just northeast of Jasper here. Our oldest treated sites were treated in 2003. The intermediate were 2009, and then our most recently treated sites were collected in 2020, was treated in 2022, and the field data was collected later in that summer. And so, as you might expect, stands treated that year can look much different than stands treated 20 years ago. And I'm just trying to evaluate how this buildup of fuel from the surface fuel bed and that connectivity between the ground and the crown can impact potential fire behavior. To do this, I'm using the conifer pyrometrics modeling framework, which is a really neat new tool from Dan Parakis with Natural Resources Canada. It's really quite a neat framework as it allows for a lot more dynamic inputs than historical modeling tools, including a stand adjusted moisture content from Watton and Beverly, a reanalysis of the Crown Fire Initiation spread model from crews, including new fire data points as recent as 2019. And then these dynamic fuel inputs of the canopy, fuel loading, the surface fuel consumption, and then this concept of the fuel strata gap, which can account for that regenerating sapling story and that decreasing gap as regeneration occurs, and how that can influence crown fire potential. So what we're seeing for surface fuel loads, we have substantially less shrub loading in managed stands than in unmanaged stands, but we are seeing more seedlings present in both the 13 years since treatment stands and 19 years since treatment stands. And we are also seeing substantially more coarse woody debris in the most recently treated stands and the oldest treated stands, which kind of aligns with some prescriptions of leaving large bowls and stems on the ground for habitat and some moisture retention purposes. But in the canopy is where we really start to see significant differences. Overstory stand density had an average of 72% reduction over all of the treatment years, and sapling stand density had an average of 90% reduction, with the 13-year-old treatments showing the least amount of reduction in saplings. And that's reflected in the canopy bulk density. As you can see, the most recently treated stands have very, very little canopy bulk density in comparison with unmanaged stands. Interestingly, we are seeing quite a lot of retention in that 13-year category, but those did have quite a few very large Doug firs present, and so those are contributing to that. And so to see which fuel components were accounting for the variation between stand types, I conducted a principal components analysis with analysis of similarity test. And you can see these small green diamonds are the unmanaged sites. So those also have quite a bit of variation between them. But there's clear partitioning between it and the managed stands, with most similarity between the 0 years and the oldest treatment stands, which is interesting. But this is largely driven by that sapling cohort. And then when I input into conifer pyrometrics, I ran 3 different wind scenarios for each of the 90th, 95th, and 97th fire weather percentiles for Jasper Warden Station normals. And as you can see, in light wind, the treatments all had lower mitigated rates of spread in comparison to the green unmanaged stands. But as the wind increases, those 13-year-old treatments, you see much similar, or quite a lot of similar behavior or rate in the rate of spread in comparison to unmanaged stands. However, the 19 years since treatment and most recently treated stands retain that mitigation in fire behavior all the way throughout. However, the unmanaged stands did have active crown fire predicted most of the time, and the 13 years since treatment did have passive crown fire predicted the majority of the time, whereas the 0 years since treatment and the 19 years since treatment predicted surface fire most of the time, with some few instances of passive crown when you get up to that 97th weather percentile. And so I know I have limited field measured sites that I'm running through these models here, and that may not be able to capture the entirety of the variability of managed stands across the park. But my colleague, Dr. Zhou Zhenji, when we went and collected these field data, we also did terrestrial laser scans, and we also have coincident airborne LiDAR for pretty much the entirety of the coverage of the park. And so he's developed a neural network algorithm with the TLS data to scale this to our airborne LiDAR to successfully get canopy metrics from our airborne LiDAR, which we can relate down to the I can take more plots to run through my fire prediction systems and really flesh out and try to see what we're dealing with. It can extract crown bulk density, mean subcanopy height, DBH, and biomass from this tool. So this is a work in progress. I have a lot to do still, but the kind of conifer pyrometrics model finds fuel strata gap and canopy fuel loading high determinants of crown fire potential. And as you saw, it wasn't a linear time since management increasing rate of spread or crown fire potential with those 13-year-old stands being the most like unmanaged stands. However, the canopy bulk density, if it was under 0.1 kilograms per meter cubed, we saw much less crown fire initiation. And so that could be what's happening with that 13-year-old treatment sites. They, on average, had a higher crown bulk density. And so I will also perform a model sensitivity analysis, shuffling the trees around, maybe removing those outlier large trees and seeing how that impacts the crown fire initiation and rate of spread. Thank you so much. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.
All right. Thank you very much, Tristan. It is awesome to see two absolutely stellar new scientists coming out into the mix. And I'm going to turn it over now to Kate. So Kate, if you just want to pop in. And there we go. Kate.
So I will share my screen.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Sorry, just getting set up here. Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, awesome. So thank you. My name is Kate Kitchens. I am a final year PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, and I work with Laurie Daniels and Alan Carroll to study bark beetle and wood borer outbreaks after wildfires and how disturbance interactions can lead to ecological surprises and complex outcomes for recovering forests after disturbances. So when I tell people that I study bark beetles and wildfires, a lot of people think that what I study is that insect outbreaks happen. Take mountain pine beetle as an example, building off of what Tristan was talking about a minute ago, and whether or not this increase in mortality over a certain area could actually increase wildfire likelihood and severity through increased fuel loading. But bark beetles and wildfires are a very historically significant interaction in Western North America, and they're actually bidirectional. So we don't always need to think about bark beetle outbreaks affecting wildfire effects. What I study is the opposite end of this. So what we can think of, and what I think is also a really important thing to study and understand, is how wildfires can actually facilitate bark beetle outbreaks. So we think about this in general by saying that wildfires kill trees, obviously, but they also leave standing, surviving, yet severely injured in some cases, many, many more trees in the forest environment. And it's those trees, when they become compromised in their defenses, that become susceptible to secondary agents of disturbance like bark beetles. And so my supervisor, Alan, and I like to call this food loading on the landscape as opposed to fuel loading on the opposite end of the spectrum. And so when we think about managing post-fire forests, I think there's a classical assumption here that wildfires always lead to bark beetle outbreaks. When you talk to managers, when you read literature, even talk to other entomologists, everybody says the same thing. But when you actually get on the ground and you start looking at things and you dig a little deeper into those papers, what you find is that this isn't actually always true. Outbreak dynamics of eruptive insect species are very complex, and outbreaks don't always happen. So, and we don't really know why. So what I like to say is that after wildfires, insects are a certainty, but outbreak levels of insects are not assured. And so a large part of my PhD is trying to help us understand why outbreaks happen after some wildfire events, but not other fires. So to do this, I studied Douglas fir beetle. Douglas fir beetle is a dendroctonous tree-killing bark beetle. It's the primary biotic mortality agent of Douglas fir across the native range of this tree. And like other bark beetles, it mines and reproduces in the phloem layer. And you can actually see in this photo that I have of a large strip of bark from a dead Douglas fir, you can see the evidence of this. So we have the long maternal galleries running up and down this bark strip and the larval galleries going side to side. And so outbreaks of this insect are completely dependent upon pulses of defensively compromised material. So this is why bark beetle outbreaks after wildfires is such a common occurrence, especially for Douglas fir beetle. And so traditionally we would call these secondary insects, insects which require a primary disturbance to elevate their populations. And in terms of a management perspective, the reason why we care about this is because Douglas fir beetle can come in and cause as much as 50 to 100% mortality of surviving trees after wildfires. And we've known this for a long time, but again, understanding the drivers of this relationship is unknown and is still being worked on. And that's what I study. So to get at this, over the last many years that I've been at UBC, we investigated 3 wildfires in South Central British Columbia, which burned in the 2017 fire season. So I got to work on the Elephant Hill and Hansel Risky Creek fires, 2 of the largest fires of that season. Together, they comprise, I think, almost 500,000 hectares, which burned in the span of a couple months. So pretty significant fires in recent history. And we set a number of plots, looked at a ton of trees, and without getting too much into it, we essentially said, let's look across the entire range of fire severity on these burn complexes, and let's measure things which are relevant to bark beetle ecology. Things like tree size, fire injury, the amount of host on the landscape, how much Douglas fir was there, what was the age, what was the composition of these stands. And then we also conducted pretty intensive insect population surveys as well. And so this is actually a photo of what those looked like. So by taking bark strips off these trees and counting the entrance holes of females and the exit holes of her brood, we were actually able to calculate whether stands were sources or sinks for populations. So in other words, in simple terms, was an area fostering an outbreak or was it not fostering an outbreak? And trying to understand why. And so at the beginning of my field collection in 2019, I just assumed that most of these samples would look like this, which is a phloem sample which is completely occupied by Douglas fir beetle only. But what we actually found the majority of the time was this sample that we have on the right. And this is critically different in one way. In the areas that I've outlined in this red box, there's pretty significant evidence of mining by wood boring species. So buprested and cerambycid wood borers, which mine in the phloem layer, but also finish their development in the sapwood and can cause millions of dollars of damage to post-fire trees and injured trees across the province by degrading the merchantable part of a tree. So current literature says that these guys don't really exist in trees at the same time. And my research was showing in the field that they were. And so we actually hypothesized that perhaps the reason why bark beetle outbreaks occur sometimes and don't occur other times could be because of competition from other species like wood borers. So if you've never actually seen these insects before, this is an adult Douglas fir beetle. It's about the size of a grain of rice. It's in my hand. And this is the size of an adult white-spotted Sawyer beetle, which is an example of a cerambycid wood borer. So you can see virtually at any part of their life stage, these insects are vastly different in size and the effects that they can have on these trees. So they can both kill trees, they can both injure trees. But when we're thinking about competition and population dynamics, we can see that there may be an imbalance here. So this led us to a number of hypotheses and predictions. I'm just going to go over one with you today as I finish up this presentation. We said, given all this literature on bark beetle ecology which exists, we know that Douglas fir beetle searches to optimize access to high quality, undefended phloem resources, these pulses of injured trees across the landscape post-fire. But we also know that they require phloem that is still suitable for insect development. So we can't be looking in, highly severely burnt areas. We probably need trees which have some phloem which is still intact. So because of this hypothesis, we predicted that Douglas fir beetle reproductive performance, or the likelihood of an outbreak by this insect, would be greatest in stands that had accessible high-quality phloem, but also had little to no interspecific competition by wood-boring species, coming from those pictures that I showed you in the previous slide. And so to do this, we did a series of models. I won't go into exactly how we created those today, but essentially we used generalized additive models, which is a regression, but I can make it bendy. And the fact that I could make it bendy is kind of important because my hypothesis has this assumption about thresholds, right? We're not just saying more infestation is always going in one direction. We're hypothesizing that there are windows or, certain small areas of characteristics which may be suitable for bark beetle outbreaks. So we described the offspring per female. The outbreak likelihood of this insect was significantly influenced by the following variables: fire injury, which was dependent upon tree size, the distance to existing outbreaks by this insect, and the proportion of wood borers within a stand. And if you're familiar with statistics, you may know that sometimes we use R squared as a metric to tell us how well our model is performing. And this model performs at almost 75% variance explained. So we're basically saying that, we can explain 75% of what's going on with about a 25% margin of error, or things that we can't explain in this system, just with these 4 variables, which were very quick and easy to measure. So we're quite happy with these results. So I'm going to show you actually what these results look like now. So the first and most important variable in this model was fire injury dependent upon tree size. So if we look at this graph, we can see offspring per female on the y-axis and the percent of fire injury averaged for the stand on the x-axis. And you can see that this was broken up into 3 size categories. So this would have been the average tree size per stand. And so we can see that stands which are high volume, stands which averaged 36 centimeters in DBH or greater, were the most likely to foster explosive population growth 1 year after wildfires, but only in stands which were moderately injured. And we can see that other stands were likely to have increased populations, but at much lower capacities than these target stands. And so we've called these our Goldilocks zones, the part where phloem is just right and the conditions are just right to foster an outbreak. So if you're managing post-fire, these are probably the stands that you would want to more intensively manage if you're worried about bark beetle impacts. The second variable that was a significant predictor was the distance to existing outbreaks by bark beetles, by Douglas fir beetle. And this makes sense when we just think about immigration pathways. So if you have elevated populations of your insect within 10 kilometers of the area that I was looking at, immigration is easier, mate finding is easier, and so you're more likely to have outbreaks if you have other outbreaks near you. I think that is a pretty self-explanatory variable. And then finally, the most exciting variable that came out of this model, I think, was the proportion of wood borers within a stand significantly affected the ability for Douglas fir beetle to outbreak. And so to preface this final result, I'll just say that we did preference modeling, in other words, infestation choice, where we said what trees and stands were being infested by bark beetles and wood borers. And the results of those models were that trees and stands with exactly the same characteristics, which were large in size and moderately injured, were most likely to be infested. And then this result is showing us the outcome of that decision. So the decision that they're both co-occurring in these trees, what is this affecting? How is this affecting outbreak likelihood? So we can see that this is highly curvilinear. And what this is telling us is that if stands have less than 40% occupation by wood borers, Douglas fir beetle and wood borers are able to coexist together. Douglas fir beetle is still able to outbreak in these environments. But when wood borers occupy more than 40% of a stand, that they become a negative competitive pressure on the ability for Douglas fir beetle to outbreak. In other words, a secondary insect, which not a lot of other research has ever really invested time in, is actually regulating the ability for a primary bark beetle to outbreak. So we're pretty excited by this result. This was a big surprise for us. And I think it leads to a lot of other successive questions about this system that really should be looked at. So just to wrap us up here, there are a number of research implications. Within the case of a pulse-driven eruptive species like Douglas fir beetle, we found that if there was no competition by other insects in the environment, Douglas fir beetle is most likely to outbreak in stands which are high in volume, large in diameter, and moderately injured versus high severity stands, which I think typically is where a lot of targeted management tends to go. And that Douglas fir beetle performance was constrained by wood-boring insects. And so further work understanding these populations will be necessary to better predict outbreaks by bark beetles. So going all the way back to my first slide, we did show that wildfires do cause food loading and that this does cause insect outbreaks, but that insect outbreaks were contingent upon a number of other factors in the environment. And so this is leading us now to a number of future questions that I'm investigating as I finish my PhD research around chronic versus isolated areas. So this idea that if you have chronic amounts of disturbance over a certain time period, these areas may foster wood-boring populations, which could in turn mitigate your risk to bark beetle outbreaks. But if you have areas with very little historical disturbance, that these may be the areas that we're going to be most concerned about to foster bark beetle outbreaks. But research on this question is ongoing. Thank you so much. And I will stop my screen sharing and allow us to move on to the next speaker.
All right.
Okay, so great. Hi, everyone. So I'm an ecology student, master student at Université du Québec at Abitibi-Témiscamingue. I'm supervised by Yves Bergeron from UCAT, but also Jonathan Boucher at Natural Resources Canada. My topics is about restoration tools for the eastern white pine and red pines, and the use of prescribed burning as silvicultural tools. As you probably know, both species are northeastern American coniferous. They both thrive on sandy and infertile soils. They could reach great heights, over 30 meters. They are long-lived, but they also reach their maturity with at diameter at breast height over 20 centimeters. You could observe them at all stages of succession. Although a red pine is more considered a pioneer species because it's a shade tolerant, while eastern white pine is more considered a mid tolerant. They are both important, economically, but also historically and for the ecology, and also culturally. If you think about First Nations, even the city of Montreal has it on its own flag since 2017. The main observation is that both species are observing a diminution of their abundance all over their range. And the fact is, they do have difficulty to germinate and establish under the cover of the overstory. And I'm looking for to understand what is the phenomenon that are involved and how that we could mitigate them as forest manager. As you probably know, red pine and eastern white pine are fire-adapted species. They do need surface fire to germinate. It's in their ecological circle. Meanwhile, while red pine is highly dependent and adapted to fire, eastern wine pile is also adapted a fire dependent in a lesser extent. But the thing is, surface fire are rarer since the industrializations. There is an historical buildup of the fuels all over the understory of the northeastern forest, which creates more inflammable and conditions and rise the probability for more severe chrome fire, which is not related to their ecological cycle. But you have to know that it's not all wildfire that they are bad, they are even desirable at some point. My objective was to identify the success factor of the prescribed burning as a civic cultural tool, which will promote the germination and the establishment of pine seedlings. So first, I wanted to know what is the relationship between the regeneration density and the severity, and with that, make it concrete recommendation for forest manager. So the first hypothesis that I make was that there was a quadratic relation between burn severity and the pine seedlings establishment. In other and simpler words, low and high severity burns were not good. Didn't do good conditions. Meanwhile, a medium burn creates the ideal conditions. Also, other hypotheses, the second one was about more chemical property, and the third one was about physical property that have an effect on the regeneration success of pine after the burn. So I did my study all over 2 provinces, the province of Quebec and also Ontario. I had 22 burn plot and 7 unburned plot. I did my survey during the summer of 2021, which gave me 3 to 5 years post-burn effects. My sample plot were 10 by 10 macro plots. I did some survey about the composition of trees and saplings. Also surveyed the natural regeneration and seeds bed, the understory vegetations. I did some canopy openness assessment and also a severity assessments with the use of the composite burn index created by Kim Benson in 2006. As you probably know, a lot of different studies did their severity assessment, create some categorical classes, but instead of that, I decided to use the CBI by Kim Benson to have a more continuous index, which gave me not only 3 categories such as low, medium, and high severity, but will give me more information with a numerical index. And my result is that yes, I did have a more dense regeneration of pines, both combined, red and white pines, with a medium severity burn. And I did collect other data that could give me more information about to explain why it's like that. So I will explore them a little bit more, but it's about light availability. There also less competition, better seed bed, and more nutrient. As I told you, with medium severity burn, there is more lights available with sufficient mortality of this all over the stands, but the burn wasn't so much high to cause mortality to the seed trees, the pine seed trees. Also, there was yes some understory competition, but not so much. I'm thinking about woody brushes, herbs, and ferns. There was there was also good seed belts with plenty of available mineral soils and thinner organic layer. There were more nutrients available with more nitrogen, higher pH, and more cations also. And the other things I did, it was a stepwise selections that helped me to isolate other variables that were important for the origination, except with the combination of the burn severity. So I isolated the textures variable, which was really important. As you could see, it gives me like, if you see the model at the left side, you can see that there was more dense regeneration over 40,000 seedlings per hectare, with a combination of sand and sand-loam over 60%. Why is it like that? It's because there was less water available, but also less nutrient available, which create condition that that the white pines and red pine seedlings were more competitive in comparison of other species. So at the end, if I could conclude with that, I will say that yes, surface fire are important for the natural cycle of those species, but perhaps fire management should consider more intense fire sometime in order to have a balance between the best condition for those seedlings and high mortalities. It's also important before to plan a prescribed fire to consider the good sites to do those treatments, and to make sure that the soil texture and the drainage is good enough for that. Also, other characteristics that I didn't consider, just were the seed years, and also I have to say that it's really important to monitor all over the years, because I did only that observation for 3 to 5 years after the burn, and maybe some future action such as mechanical and chemical treatment will be required in the future. So yeah, that's it for my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So I wanted to say, I want to thank all of the speakers. I'm just going to put ahead here. You know, you guys did absolutely fantastic, and we've asked you to, you know, be taking a whole bunch of your research and shoving it into a very short presentation. So what I'm going to say to all of our presenters here, there's the emails up there. We had a couple questions, but we don't really have a lot of time for questions. For everybody, for our speakers, if you guys can pop your email into the chat, just because it's easier to copy and paste from there, that would be great. And yeah, if you can pop your email into the chat, that would be great. What we've had in the past with the students is people have reached out to the students after and really interacted with them via their email and stuff. So I really encourage you to do that. And I also note that there was a couple comments for Tristan and for Jen and stuff up a little bit higher. And I think that some of that was answered. But I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank you for bridging the new platform. And in particular, I want to thank our speakers. They were absolutely fantastic. I'm just going to stop the recording.